Have you ever looked at a world map, seen the vast differences in wealth, power, and technological advancement between continents, and found yourself wondering why? Why did human history unfold so incredibly differently for peoples across the globe?
It's a huge question.
It is. And it's a question that can make you shudder, maybe, and for good reason, because the easy, simplistic answers often lead us down incredibly dark and prejudiced paths.
Yeah, they really do.
But what if we told you there's a different way to look at it? A powerful, evidence-based way that doesn't involve inherent differences in human biology or race at all, but rather the deep forces of our planet itself.
Indeed, this deep dive is all about tackling that fundamental, almost terrifying question head on. Our mission today is to push back the chain of historical causation as far as possible, to peel back the layers and understand the ultimate explanations for these profound disparities. We're going to explore the deep environmental forces, not human biology, not innate intelligence that truly shaped civilizations and led to the vastly different worlds we see today.
And our guide for this fascinating, sometimes provocative journey is a groundbreaking work that fundamentally changed how we understand human history. Guns, Germs, and Steel: The Fates of Human Societies by Jared Diamond.
A really seminal book.
Absolutely. This isn't just a book. It's an attempt to provide a short history of everyone for the last 13,000 years. And it all started with a single, simple, yet incredibly profound question from a man in New Guinea named Yali.
Right, Yali's question. It's the perfect starting point.
Okay, let's unpack this moment because it's where this entire historical quest begins. Imagine yourself in New Guinea in 1972, sitting with a local politician named Yali. You're chatting, and he turns to you with this penetrating glance, asking, why is it that you white people developed so much cargo and brought it to New Guinea, but we black people had little cargo of our own?
Wow.
It's a striking question, isn't it? It captures the profound global disparity in a very personal, direct, and almost uncomfortably honest way. He's literally asking, why are your societies so much more materially advanced than ours?
And what's so fascinating here is that Yali's question, while incredibly simple in its phrasing, goes right to the heart of the vast observable disparities in global wealth and power.
Exactly.
It highlights the huge difference in lifestyles between, say, average New Guineans and average Europeans or Americans, or really any industrialized people. These aren't minor differences. They demand potent, fundamental causes. Yali's experience observing the stark contrast in cargo, the material goods, technology, and wealth between his people and the colonizers, made this question incredibly pressing and central to his life. A question that countless people in less industrialized societies have asked themselves.
Now, for many, that question, especially phrased in terms of white people and black people, might immediately conjure uncomfortable, even racist thoughts about differences in human intelligence or capability.
Right, the immediate flawed assumption.
It's a historical trap, a path often taken by those seeking easy but deeply flawed answers that have led to immense suffering throughout history. But our source, Jared Diamond, emphatically argues against that.
Vehemently.
In fact, he turns the usual racist assumption on its head, quite provocatively, using his own extensive experience.
And this raises an absolutely crucial question. What exactly is wrong with racist explanations? And Diamond's answer is unequivocal. They are not just loathsome and morally repugnant, they are factually, demonstrably wrong.
Factually wrong. That's key.
Diamond spent 33 years working with New Guineans, living among them, observing their societies firsthand, learning their languages. His conclusion, based on decades of direct observation, was that they are, on average, more intelligent, alert, and expressive than the average European or American.
More intelligent, that really flips the script.
It does. He noted their exceptional ability at tasks like forming intricate mental maps of unfamiliar surroundings, navigating complex jungle terrain skills that most Westerners, dropped into a similar environment, would utterly lack.
I certainly would.
Me too. And here's why. This isn't about some vague notion of natural intelligence, but rather about different historical selection pressures. In densely populated European societies, for example, infectious epidemic diseases were a major cause of death for millennia. Those who survived and reproduced often had some genetic resistance, maybe, but raw intelligence wasn't necessarily the primary trait for evading invisible killers like smallpox.
Right. You can't outsmart a virus in the same way.
Exactly. In contrast, in traditional New Guinean societies where population densities were much lower, the crowd diseases common in Europe simply hadn't evolved to be widespread. Instead, high mortality came from things like murder, chronic tribal warfare, accidents, and the constant practical challenges in procuring food in a difficult environment.
Very different survival challenges.
Totally different. So survival and reproductive success often depended on traits like acute alertness, sharp practical intelligence, physical prowess, and sophisticated social savvy. Therefore, there's no hint of intellectual disadvantage in New Guineans. If anything, Diamond suggests a likely genetic advantage and certainly superior developmental conditions in traditional societies, often free from many of the developmental disadvantages found in industrialized nations.
Wow. So the big takeaway here isn't just that racist explanations are morally and factually wrong, but that the very places people live and the challenges they face profoundly shape the skills and attributes needed to thrive, fundamentally altering our assumptions about what intelligence even means.
Absolutely.
It's not about innate differences in people then, but about something deeper, something outside of human biology. If it's not race, then what on earth is it? We need to peel back the layers of this historical onion.
Exactly. The book's entire emphasis is on searching for these ultimate explanations, pushing back the chain of historical causation as far as possible. The cargo itself, the guns, germs, and steel, these are merely proximate factors.
Okay, the immediate things.
Right. They were the immediate causes of European conquests, the direct tools and advantages that led to those lopsided outcomes. But if we stop there, we've only described what happened, not why. We need to ask why Europeans ended up with them, rather than other peoples in other parts of the world. What were the fundamental deep-seated conditions that enabled these proximate factors to develop and flourish in one region more than another? That's the real question.
That's a staggering thought, that these immediate tools of conquest were themselves just symptoms. So those were the what. We're now getting into the why, the ultimate cause, right? But before we dive into that, here's where it gets really interesting. To truly grasp the immediate causes, the proximate factors in action, let's plunge into one of history's most dramatic and brutal encounters. Francisco Pizarro's capture of the Inca Emperor Atahualpa in 1532 at Cajamarca, high in the Andes.
Cajamarca, yeah. A pivotal moment.
You had 168 Spaniards against an Inca army that eyewitness accounts describe as 500 times larger and estimated 80,000 soldiers.
Just think about those odds. Terrifying.
The outcome: thousands of Incas killed, not a single Spaniard lost. It's a moment that seems almost unbelievable in its one-sidedness, almost mythical.
And this lopsided outcome wasn't a fluke. It was a devastating pattern. It's a powerful, almost surgical illustration of the proximate factors at play.
Okay.
Eyewitness accounts from the Spaniards describe their own terror and uncertainty, but also the sheer terrifying effectiveness with which their technology and tactics overwhelmed the Incas. Atahualpa, despite his absolute authority over his subjects and his formidable army, walked into a trap because he had no historical precedent for such a threat. His society, isolated for millennia, had no experience with the military technology and strategies the Europeans brought.
He just couldn't conceive of it.
Pretty much. He saw the small number of Spaniards as a curiosity, a minor nuisance at best, not a formidable existential threat, which proved to be a fatal miscalculation. Pizarro's capture of Atahualpa was not an isolated incident either. Accounts of Pizarro's subsequent battles against the Incas and Cortez's against the Aztecs in Mexico repeatedly describe a few dozen European horsemen routing thousands of indigenous soldiers with great slaughter, proving these factors to be consistently and brutally decisive.
So what exactly allowed Pizarro's tiny band, barely more than a raiding party, to achieve such a crushing, almost miraculous victory against such overwhelming numerical odds? What was in that cargo Yali talked about?
Firstly, military technology. The Spaniards possessed steel weapons and armor, far superior to Inca stone, bronze, and wood weaponry.
Steel, that's a big one.
Huge. Their Toledo steel swords could slice through anything the Incas possessed, while Inca clubs and lances were ineffective against steel armor and shields. But perhaps even more crucial were the horses.
Ah, the horses.
Domesticated around 4000 BC in the steppes north of the Black Sea. These magnificent animals were akin to ancient jeeps and Sherman tanks combined.
Wow, what a comparison.
Well, think about it. They gave the Spaniards unparalleled speed and maneuverability, shock value in a charge, and a height advantage that, alongside the sheer novelty of these beasts, terrified the unmounted Inca soldiers who had never seen such animals before.
Completely alien.
Completely. Horses remained a potent military weapon for an astonishing 6,000 years, revolutionizing warfare from the Ukraine to China, and were still crucial until World War I. For instance, the Plains Indians of North America, who acquired horses and then rifles from Europeans in the 17th century, were transformed into formidable warriors and fought off white expansion for far longer than other tribes, demonstrating the truly transformative power of these imports.
Right.
Guns, though primitive harquebuses compared to later firearms, also provided a psychological and tactical edge, creating loud noises and smoke and firing projectiles that could penetrate armor at a distance.
So it's the shock and awe factor, too.
Definitely part of it.
But it wasn't just about the battlefield tech, was it? There was a hidden killer, an invisible enemy that wrought far more devastation than any sword or musket. We're talking about the silent biological weapon that preceded the Europeans.
Absolutely. The most devastating proximate factor was infectious diseases.
Germs.
Germs. European germs, endemic in Eurasia due to centuries of large, dense populations living in close quarters with domesticated animals, spread from tribe to tribe far in advance of the Europeans themselves.
So the diseases arrived before the people sometimes.
Often, yes. Native Americans had no prior exposure and thus no evolved resistance to these crowd diseases like smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus, and plague.
There's no immunity at all.
None. These were literally a lethal gift of livestock that devastated populations with no evolved resistance. The numbers are staggering. An estimated 95% of the pre-Columbian Native American population was wiped out in the century or two following Columbus's arrival.
95%? That's almost unimaginable.
It's catastrophic. For instance, the highly organized Mississippian chiefdoms of North America, some of the most advanced native societies, virtually disappeared between 1492 and the late 1600s, largely due to disease, before Europeans even made their first permanent settlement on the Mississippi River. The impact on Hispaniola's Indian population was even more stark, declining from around 8 million at Columbus's arrival to virtually zero by 1535. This biological onslaught cleared the way for conquest more effectively than any army.
So it's a horrific package. Advanced weaponry, terrifying steeds, and an invisible biological war. But beyond the battlefield and these invisible enemies, there were other, equally significant underlying factors at play that allowed for such grand-scale conquest. It's a systemic advantage, not just a tactical one.
Yes, there were several other critical factors. European maritime technology allowed Pizarro to cross vast oceans, building the ships that took him from Spain to Panama and then into the Pacific.
Couldn't get there without the ships.
Obviously not. Without the ability to navigate these immense distances, none of it would have been possible. Then there's centralized political organization of European states.
Okay, how did that play in?
It provided the resources and structure to launch and sustain expeditions of conquest. Unlike many smaller, fragmented societies elsewhere, European kingdoms had the capacity for long-term planning, funding, and logistical support for such distant ventures. They could bankroll these risky, expensive trips.
And maintain them over time.
Exactly. And finally, writing.
Writing. How is that a weapon?
It gave Europeans a massive advantage in sharing information, accumulating knowledge across generations from maps to sailing directions, military strategies, historical accounts of past successes and failures, even medical knowledge and coordinating large-scale efforts that Native Americans, largely lacking widespread writing, simply could not match. Pizarro knew about Cortez's tactics in Mexico partly through written accounts.
Learning from previous conquests.
Precisely. These are the immediate reasons for European success, the proximate factors. But they force us to ask the deeper, more profound question. How did Europeans acquire these advantages in the first place, and why didn't other peoples develop them? This is where we move from the what to the ultimate why.
So, if guns, germs, and steel are the proximate factors, the immediate tools of conquest, then what's the ultimate cause? What was the foundational shift that created this massive power imbalance? Where did all this power really come from at its roots? This is where the narrative really shifts from specific battles to the fundamental shaping of human societies.
The answer, if we truly connect this to the bigger picture and push back that chain of historical causation, lies in food production, the domestication of plants and animals.
Farming. It all comes back to farming.
Pretty much.
Right.
This revolutionary shift, beginning around 11,000 BC, was a monumental game changer for humanity. By selecting and growing those few species of plants and animals we can eat, we can make them constitute a much higher percentage of biomass on an acre of land compared to wild foraging.
Okay.
This meant 1 acre could feed 10 to 100 times more people than hunting-gathering. This brute strength of numbers was the first foundational military advantage. More people means bigger armies eventually.
Right, sheer numbers.
And food production also enabled a sedentary lifestyle. Hunter-gatherers often needed to move frequently, which limited childbearing to about 4 years apart to ensure children could keep up on long treks.
Makes sense.
But sedentary farmers, unconstrained by carrying young children, could bear and raise as many children as they could feed, leading to shorter birth intervals of around 2 years. This, coupled with greater food supply, further dramatically increased population density.
It sounds like a fundamental reordering of human society. Not just a change in diet, but a complete transformation of how people lived and organized themselves, a ripple effect that touches everything.
Precisely. Stored food surpluses, accumulated through taxation or tribute in agricultural societies, could then support non-food producing specialists, chiefs, bureaucrats, scribes, soldiers, and specialized craftspeople like metalworkers and artisans.
People who didn't have to farm.
Exactly. This specialization fueled further innovation, allowing for complex political units like chiefdoms and kingdoms capable of sustained warfare, exploration, and monumental construction. Domestic animals also contributed directly in multiple ways.
How so? Beyond just meat.
Oh, yes. They provided meat and milk, which offered essential protein and calories crucial for health and survival. Crucially, they provided fertilizer. Animal manure is still a major source of crop fertilizer today, even with synthetic alternatives significantly enhancing soil fertility and agricultural output.
Right, fertilizer's huge.
And of course, they pulled plows, making agriculture far more efficient and allowing cultivation of larger areas. For example, horses, cattle, and donkeys were also used to turn wheels for grinding grain and raising water for irrigation, exponentially increasing agricultural output and supporting even larger, more complex populations. This is the ultimate engine of societal complexity.
But if food production is the key, why did it arise in some places earlier or more effectively than others? Were some wild plants and animals just inherently better candidates for domestication? Or was it simply a matter of human ingenuity and effort? It seems like a cruel biological lottery.
Indeed, it was a biological lottery. Not all wild species are equally suited for domestication. In fact, very few are.
Really? Very few.
Very few. The process often involved unconscious selection by early farmers, picking plants with bigger seeds or non-bitter mutations. Think of the ancestral almond. Wild almonds contain deadly amygdalin, which makes them incredibly bitter and poisonous.
Right, I've heard that.
But occasional mutant trees lack this bitter compound. While these sweet mutants would die out quickly and the wild birds and animals would eat all their seeds, curious early humans would sample them, find them palatable, and plant those seeds, thus propagating the desirable mutation.
Huh. Accidental selection almost?
In many early cases, yes. Some plants, like wild wheat and barley in the Fertile Crescent, required minimal genetic changes to become productive crops, transforming within centuries due to their inherent suitability. Corn, on the other hand?
Corn seems like a big one.
It is, but it needed drastic changes over thousands of years from its wild ancestor teosinte to become the productive crop we know today, including losing its rock-hard seed casings and dramatically increasing cob size. This required immense time and effort.
Thousands of years.
Uh-huh.
Wow. And animals. I recall something about an Anna Karenina principle being applied to them. It's a fascinating concept for explaining why so few species were ever domesticated, almost a biological law of failure.
That's right, the Anna Karenina principle applies perfectly to animal domestication. The phrase, all happy families are alike, each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way, coined by Tolstoy, succinctly captures this.
Okay, how does that apply to animals?
Out of thousands of wild mammal species weighing over 100 pounds, only a tiny handful ended up in happy marriages with humans. Most candidates were disqualified for one of many reasons, each an unhappy way to fail.
Like what? What makes an animal undomesticable?
Several things. Their diet might be too picky, like carnivores, or requiring massive amounts of feed, making them uneconomical. Their growth rate might be too slow, like elephants. Their mating habits might be too complex or secretive to reproduce in captivity, like cheetahs' intricate courtship rituals.
Cheetahs. People try to domesticate cheetahs.
Oh yes, for hunting. But they couldn't breed them reliably in captivity because of those rituals involving chases over large areas. Similarly, attempts to breed vicuñas for their prized wool failed due to their mating habits and male intolerance in captivity.
Fascinating. What else?
Their disposition just too nasty or aggressive, like grizzlies or rhinos. Their tendency to panic too flighty and prone to injury when confined, like most deer and antelope. Or problematic social organizations, solitary or territorial animals, or herds without a clear dominance hierarchy that humans can exploit.
So lots of ways to fail.
Many ways. This is why efforts to domesticate animals like cheetahs or zebras failed for thousands of years, despite strong human motivation.
And this is where Eurasia had a truly immense, almost unfair advantage in this biological lottery.
A massive advantage. It had the largest number of big terrestrial wild mammal species, 72 candidates weighing over 100 pounds, due to its immense landmass and ecological diversity.
72 compared to.
Compared to the Americas, which due to massive extinctions around 13,000 years ago, wiping out its own native horses, most camels and other promising candidates had far fewer. Australia had even fewer.
So the die-offs were critical.
Absolutely critical. This vastly different biological endowment meant Eurasia ended up with 13 species of big domestic mammals: cows, sheep, goats, pigs, horses, various camels, donkeys.
The familiar farm animal.
Pretty much. While the Americas had only one very local species, the llama alpaca, which wasn't suitable for pulling plows or riding, and a few others like turkeys and guinea pigs, whose significance was trivial by comparison.
So the sheer availability of suitable species in Eurasia gave it an enormous head start, a critical pool of raw materials for developing the advanced agricultural systems that would underpin complex societies. It's not just about having the idea of farming, but having the right ingredients right outside your door.
Exactly. The right biological raw materials were just there in much greater abundance.
So Eurasia had more raw materials for food production, more of those happy families of domesticable plants and animals. But what about getting those innovations, those new crops and animals, to spread from one society to another? Does the very shape of a continent matter?
Oh, it matters hugely.
We're not just talking about the initial spark, but the ability for that spark to ignite a widespread transformative fire.
It turns out the orientation of a continent has enormous, sometimes tragic, consequences. Eurasia's major axis is predominantly east-west.
Right, it's wide.
Wide. The Americas and Africa, however, are predominantly north-south. They're tall and relatively narrow.
Okay.
This seemingly simple geographic feature profoundly affected the rate of spread for crops, livestock, writing, and other inventions. It's not just about what you invent, but how quickly those innovations can diffuse to other societies and benefit a wider population.
Why would that make such a big difference? Latitude and longitude seem like abstract lines on a map, but you're saying they have a tangible historical impact on everything, from crops to culture.
Absolutely. The crucial point is that climates, growing seasons, day lengths, and even diseases are strongly linked to latitude.
Right, things change as you go north or south.
Dramatically. Plants and animals are genetically programmed to specific environmental conditions. Imagine a Mexican corn variety planted in Canada. It would germinate too early and be killed by frost, and its slow growth rate, adapted to Mexico's long growing season, would prevent it from maturing before Canadian autumn frosts.
Makes sense. It needs the right climate.
Precisely. Fertile crescent crops, adapted to a Mediterranean climate with mild, wet winters and long, hot, dry summers, could spread rapidly east and west across Eurasia to areas at similar latitudes without significant climatic shifts.
Because the climate stays roughly the same, moving east-west.
Exactly. They thrived in France and Japan, but struggled at the equator. This allowed a revolutionary package of domesticates, wheat, barley, peas, lentils, goats, sheep, to move from Southwest Asia to Europe, North Africa, and the Indus Valley with relative ease, along similar lines of latitude. There were no major climate zones to cross, making diffusion swift. Conversely, in the Americas and Africa, north-south diffusion was much harder. The spread of fertile crescent crops southward into Africa, for example, was stopped cold by 2,000 miles of tropical conditions between Ethiopia and South Africa.
2,000 miles of tropics.
Yep. These crops were simply not adapted to warm temperatures and constant day lengths. They couldn't thrive outside their latitudinal comfort zone. Similarly, African tropical crops struggled to move south of the Fish River in South Africa into Mediterranean climates. And then there were diseases.
Diseases again.
Trypanosome diseases carried by tsetse flies also halted the spread of Eurasian livestock, like horses and cattle, which never became established south of West Africa's kingdoms, drastically limiting the military and agricultural advantages horses provided for centuries.
So it wasn't just a lack of native domesticates in some regions, but also internal continental barriers, these huge ecological walls that significantly slowed progress even when suitable species or technologies existed nearby. That's a double whammy of disadvantage.
Exactly. A real double whammy. The Americas faced similar challenges. Deserts in northern Mexico separated Mesoamerican societies from those in the U.S. Southwest. The narrow Isthmus of Panama, with its dense rainforests, created a significant ecological barrier between Mesoamerican and Andy-Amazonian societies.
Right, the Darien Gap is still formidable today.
It is. This meant that the llama and potato of the Andes never reached Mexico. And Mesoamerican corn, for example, took an astonishing 3,000, 4,000 years to cover a mere 700 miles to the eastern U.S.
3 to 4,000 years for 700 miles.
Yeah, a journey that might have taken centuries at most in an east-west Eurasia. This fragmented diffusion led to many parallel but often less robust domestications and a much slower accumulation of a comprehensive food production package compared to Eurasia.
And things like writing and the wheel face the same problems.
The same problems. Diffusion was fragmented and slow, compounding the disparities.
We touched on the devastating impact of germs earlier when discussing Cajamarca, that invisible killer that decimated populations. But this is a topic that really highlights the unforeseen, even perverse consequences of domestication. It's truly the lethal gift of livestock, isn't it? A deadly package of diseases exchanged with our animal companions that profoundly shaped human history.
Precisely. Most of humanity's deadliest crowd infectious diseases, smallpox, measles, influenza, plague, tuberculosis, typhus, cholera evolved directly from very similar ancestral microbes, causing diseases in the domestic animals with which food producers came into daily, close contact.
Living side by side with farm animals.
Exactly. Think of it. When humans began living in dense, sedentary populations, surrounded by their cows, pigs, sheep, and chickens, often living alongside them in cramped conditions, it created a perfect petri dish for pathogens. Microbes would jump from an animal to a human, go through stages of adaptation, initial exposure, then an epidemic that might die out due to lack of hosts or human immunity, and finally, a major, long-established human-specific disease. Our intimate interaction with animals created the perfect conditions for these pathogens to evolve, adapt to human bodies, and develop clever evolutionary strategies like coughing, sneezing, or diarrhea to spread efficiently from one human victim to the next, becoming highly contagious killers.
So the diseases evolved because of farming?
Largely, yes. The crowd diseases did. They need dense populations to sustain themselves, which farming provided. Eurasia's immense wealth of domestic animal species meant it became a giant breeding ground for these microbes over millennia.
More animals, more potential diseases.
Right. Its large, dense, sedentary populations, often living amid their own sewage and lacking sanitation, further accelerated the evolution of these crowd diseases. In contrast, the Americas had very few domestic animal species, and thus evolved very few lethal microbes. Villages and cities arose thousands of years later, and intercontinental trade wasn't extensive enough to link populations into vast breeding grounds for disease. As a result, when Europeans arrived, they brought a deadly arsenal of diseases against which Native Americans had no prior exposure and, critically, no evolved resistance.
We mentioned the 95% number earlier. It's just brutal.
Catastrophic is the word. An estimated 95% of the pre-Columbian Native American population wiped out in the century or two after Columbus. Hispaniola's Indian population, for example, plummeted from around 8 million at Columbus's arrival in 1492 to virtually zero by 1535. Measles alone killed a quarter of all Fijians in 1875. These cumulative mortalities, ranging from 50% to 100% in many regions, profoundly reshaped global demographics and cleared the way for European colonization.
Unintentional biological warfare.
Utterly unintentional, yet devastatingly effective. Even diseases like malaria and yellow fever, which later devastated European colonists in the American tropics, were Old World diseases introduced to the Americas via the transatlantic slave trade and European shipping, not indigenous to the Americas.
So even the diseases that later hit Europeans there weren't native. The impact on previously unexposed populations must have been catastrophic, leading to an almost complete demographic collapse in many regions. But did the Europeans always have it all their own way? Or were there instances where diseases worked against them, acting as a kind of biological defense?
Not always. This is where the story gets more nuanced. Tropical Asia, Africa, Indonesia, and New Guinea harbored their own formidable indigenous diseases like malaria, yellow fever, and cholera.
Ah, the tropics had their own defenses.
They did. These posed the most significant obstacle to European colonization of those regions, explaining why parts of Africa and New Guinea weren't fully colonized until nearly 400 years after the Americas.
400 years later, that's a huge delay.
A massive delay. These homegrown tropical diseases acted as a powerful counterdefense, creating what were famously known as white men's graves regions, so lethal to European settlers that they stemmed the tide of expansion for centuries. This biological barrier meant that direct European settlement was much harder, and colonization often took the form of limited coastal outposts or indirect control for much longer periods, a stark contrast to the rapid, devastating conquest of the Americas.
Beyond food, animals, and germs, other hallmarks of what we call civilization are often cited: metal tools, complex technology, and centralized government. How did these also emerge at different rates across the continents, and how are they inextricably connected to that foundational shift to food production we discussed earlier?
Let's first look at political organization. Human societies have generally progressed through recognizable stages, largely driven by increasing population density and the need to manage larger groups of people.
From small groups to big states.
Essentially, yes. It starts with small, egalitarian bands, typically 5 to 80 people, often nomadic hunter-gatherers, consisting mostly of close relatives. Leadership in bands is informal, based on personality or skills, and land is used communally. Most humans lived in bands until about 40,000 years ago, and a large portion still did around 11,000 years ago.
Okay, very small scale.
Very small. For instance, the Fayu hunter-gatherers of New Guinea, numbering only about 400 people across 4 clans, illustrate how fragile such a small-scale system can be, with murder and revenge killings leading to significant population reductions due to the lack of formal conflict resolution mechanisms for unrelated strangers. As groups grow, informal systems break down.
Right, you can't just rely on everyone knowing each other.
Exactly. So these then evolved into larger tribes, usually a few hundred people who were more settled, often supported by initial food production or rich local resources, and organized into multiple kinship groups or clans.
Still based on family, mostly.
Largely, yes. While still largely egalitarian, tribal land belongs to clans, and everyone knows everyone. However, resolving conflicts between unrelated individuals becomes more acute. In traditional New Guinea, encountering a stranger often meant a long discussion of shared relatives to establish a non-hostile connection before any interaction could occur safely. Wow. Many tribes have a big man who gains influence through personal attributes, but the position is not hereditary and holds limited formal power.
Okay, then what's next?
The next stage is chiefdoms, which range from thousands to tens of thousands of people. These societies feature hereditary chiefs, social stratification.
Ah, so classes start to emerge.
Clear distinctions between chiefs and commoners, yes. Also specialized craftspeople, public works like irrigation systems or monumental architecture, and early forms of tribute collection. Larger chiefdoms, like those in Hawaii or Tonga, had more powerful hereditary chiefs who could command large labor forces for monumental construction projects or warfare.
Okay, getting more complex.
Much more. The transition to chiefdoms introduces the dilemma of kleptocracy. Leaders taking wealth. At best, they provide essential public services. At worst, they transfer wealth from commoners to an elite. To maintain power, chiefs would often disarm the populace, redistribute some tribute in popular ways, offer protection, and construct an ideology or religion that justified their rule and the transfer of wealth.
Control through force, reward, and belief.
A combination, yes. And finally, states, which range from tens of thousands to billions of people, like most modern nations.
Like us today.
Exactly. These possess highly centralized government, formal laws, police, a professional bureaucracy, and often a state religion. Early states arose around 3700 BC in Mesopotamia and 300 BC in Mesoamerica. They feature cities with monumental public works, palaces, and capital accumulated through taxes.
Much more organized.
Highly formalized. Internal conflict resolution is highly formalized, often with written laws, a judiciary, and police forces. Many early states had literate elites, and writing, often developed in conjunction with state formation, as seen in Mesopotamia and Mesoamerica, to manage administration and records. Bureaucrats are selected based on training and ability rather than kinship, and states are regularly multi-ethnic and multilingual.
So this whole progression is tied to population.
Strongly linked to population density, which in turn is driven by food production. It's a process of autocatalysis.
Autocatalysis, what's that?
It means complexity and intensified food production mutually reinforce each other in a kind of escalating feedback loop. More food allows for more people, which requires more complex organization, which in turn enables more efficient food production, and so on.
So this journey from small, informal bands to complex, stratified states isn't just about how societies grow, is it? It's fundamentally tied to the food surpluses we just discussed, the very engine that allows this complexity, and ultimately the cargo that Yali saw to emerge.
That's the core idea.
And technology itself. Is it always born out of a clear, pressing need? Or is the story more complicated than that necessity is the mother of invention adage suggests?
It's definitely more complicated. It's a common misconception that necessity is the mother of invention. Often, invention is the mother of necessity.
Invention comes first. How does that work?
Most major technological breakthroughs, from the airplane to the phonograph, found their primary uses after they were invented. For instance, Thomas Edison initially proposed 10 uses for his phonograph, including preserving the last words of dying people, recording books for the blind, or teaching speaking.
Wow, none of those are what we use it for.
Right, music reproduction was not high on his list, and he even famously resisted its use for entertainment. For years, he primarily sold it as an office dictating machine, even objecting when others started using it for jukeboxes playing popular music.
He didn't want people playing music on it.
Not initially. It took him about 2 decades to reluctantly concede that its main use was playing music. This shows that many inventions are born from curiosity, accidental discovery, or solving a different problem, and then society finds entirely new, often unexpected applications for them.
Huh. So innovation is often tinkering and seeing what happens.
A lot of it is. Technology also develops cumulatively, not through isolated heroic acts. No single person invents something from scratch, independent of previous efforts.
Right, standing on the shoulders of giants.
Exactly. James Watt didn't invent the steam engine. He improved upon Thomas Newcomen's design, which itself had precursors. Each invention builds on previous ones, a long chain of incremental improvements and adaptations by many different individuals and societies over time. Prehistoric invention often involved trial and error, as Diamond observed in New Guineans experimenting with new materials or objects until they found something that worked better.
So, if inventions aren't always born from necessity and build on previous work, what determines if a society adopts and keeps them? Or if an innovation spreads and becomes truly transformative? It sounds like there's a delicate balance of factors at play.
Many factors play a crucial role. Receptivity to innovation varies greatly among societies.
Some places are just more open to new things.
Sometimes, existing systems resist change. For example, consider the QWERTY keyboard.
The one we all use.
The very one. It was designed in 1873 as a feat of anti-engineering. It intentionally employed perverse tricks, scattering common letters and concentrating them on the weaker left hand, specifically to slow down typists, to prevent early typewriters from jamming.
It was designed to be slow.
Intentionally. Even after improvements eliminated jamming, trials in 1932 showed an efficiently laid-out keyboard could double typing speed and reduce effort by 95%. But QWERTY was solidly entrenched by then.
So why didn't we switch?
The vested interest of hundreds of millions of QWERTY typists, teachers, and manufacturers crushed all moves toward efficiency for over 60 years. This demonstrates how inertia, cultural factors, and economic investment can impede incredibly useful change, even when a vastly superior alternative exists.
Wow, stuck with the slow option because we were used to it.
Pretty much. Another critical factor is geographic isolation.
Being cut off.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Isolated societies like Aboriginal Tasmanians or many Polynesian islands often lost technologies present elsewhere or simply failed to adopt new ones because the flow of ideas was cut off. Japan, for instance.
Japan, they seem very technologically advanced.
Now, yes. But despite adopting firearms enthusiastically in 1543 and becoming the world leader in gun production by 1600, they later abandoned them due to political and cultural factors such as the samurai class preferring swords as symbols of status, and the country's relative isolation allowed this reversal to persist for a time without external pressure to readopt them.
They gave up guns.
For a period, yes. And China, too, famously abandoned its technologically advanced treasure fleets after 1433 due to internal political struggles.
These fleets.
Those very ones. A decision made irreversible because of its chronic political unity that allowed a single top-down decision to shut down an entire industry across a vast empire. In Europe's fragmented landscape, if one king said no to Christopher Columbus, another might say yes.
Right.
But in a unified China, a single no was final, stalling an entire continent. This highlights that technology develops fastest in large productive regions, with many potential inventors, many competing societies, and few geographic barriers to the diffusion of ideas.
This deep dive really highlights how subtle environmental and geographic differences can lead to vastly different societal outcomes over millennia. Polynesia, with its many islands, offers a perfect natural experiment, doesn't it? A common ancestral culture diversifying dramatically under varying environmental pressures.
Indeed. It's like a living laboratory for the entire thesis. From tiny Anuta, just 100 acres, to the mini-continent of New Zealand, 103,000 square miles, Polynesian societies, all descended from a common ancestral culture around 3,200 years ago, diversified dramatically.
In what ways?
In terms of population density, political organization, technology, and warfare. The brutal collision between the Moriori of the Chatham Islands and the Maori invaders from New Zealand is a stark example.
What happened there?
The Moriori, isolated for centuries on small, cold islands, had reverted to being hunter-gatherers, with simple technology, no experience in warfare, and lacking strong leadership. Their environment did not support dense populations or advanced agriculture.
Okay, isolated and less complex.
Right. The Maori, by contrast, came from New Zealand's North Island, which supported dense populations of farmers with sophisticated agriculture, advanced weapons, and strong leadership honed by chronic intertribal warfare.
So farmers versus hunter-gatherers again.
Exactly. The outcome was utterly predictable. The Maori slaughtered the Moriori, enslaving the survivors. This illustrates how environmental variables like island climate, geological type, area, terrain fragmentation, and isolation shaped population density, resource availability, political organization, and military power, leading to outcomes ranging from small egalitarian bands to multi-island empires.
So the environment really dictated their path.
Very strongly. For example, the colder climate of the Chathams forced settlers to abandon the tropical farming they brought, while the larger, warmer Hawaiian Islands supported immense populations and highly stratified chiefdoms with specialized craftspeople.
Yeah.
Even domesticated animals varied. Isolated New Zealand ended up with only dogs, while Easter Island only had chickens, forcing them into intensive poultry farming.
That's a powerful illustration of these forces playing out. What about Australia, a continent where all native peoples remained hunter-gatherers until recent times, despite being settled around 40,000 years ago? It stands in stark contrast to Eurasia's rapid development.
Australia represents an extreme case where the deck was almost entirely stacked against the development of food production.
Yeah, so.
Its lack of domesticable, native cereals, pulses, and large animals due to mass extinctions around 40,000 years ago, leaving no large land animals other than the cassowary and kangaroo in New Guinea, combined with severe aridity over much of the continent, largely precluded the development of food production.
So, no good plants, no good animals, and too dry.
A tough combination. Instead, Aboriginal Australians developed fire stick farming, managing the landscape with fire to increase wild food resources, demonstrating deep ecological knowledge.
So they adapted, but differently.
Very sophisticated adaptation. But this deep indigenous knowledge couldn't offset the fundamental lack of domesticates. When Europeans arrived, bringing their Eurasian package of crops, livestock, and germs, Aboriginal populations were decimated by disease and overwhelmed by superior technology. The colonists simply imported their civilization. They didn't develop it locally.
Right.
As Diamond notes, Europeans themselves have never learned to survive in Australia or New Guinea without their inherited Eurasian technology, as tragically illustrated by figures like Burke and Wills, who, despite being literate and equipped with European tools, perished in regions where Aboriginal peoples thrived for millennia.
Wow, that's a stark point.
New Guinea, however, offers a fascinating contrast. Like the Fertile Crescent, it independently developed food production around 7000 BC, domesticating crops like taro, yams, and bananas.
So they did have farming.
They did, but its indigenous food production was limited by the absence of domesticable cereals, pulses, and large animals, leading to chronic protein deficiencies in the highlands. New Guineans, despite their profound knowledge of local wild plants, could not overcome these inherent limitations. For example, the Austronesian expansion. A rapid advance of food-producing peoples from Asia. They swept away hunter-gatherers in Indonesia, but struggled to make headway against the already farming New Guineans, who developed dense populations and some disease resistance. This demonstrates that even when food production is present, its specific characteristics and environmental constraints matter significantly in the trajectory of a society.
China seems like a unique case, with its long, continuous history of political and cultural unity. How does that fit into this picture, especially when contrasted with the chronic fragmentation of Europe? It almost seems like unity would always be an advantage.
It's a powerful paradox. China's chronic unity, contrasting sharply with Europe's chronic fragmentation, is also explained by geography.
Geography again. How?
China's smoother coastline and two long, navigable east-west river systems, the Yellow and Yangtze, eventually linked by canals, facilitated cultural and political unification from the coast to inland and between north and south.
Easier to connect everything.
Much easier. But this early unification allowed a single decision, like dismantling the advanced treasure fleets after 1433 due to internal court struggles, to halt technological development across the entire region. This temporary political decision became irreversible, because no shipyards remained to prove its folly or serve as a focus for rebuilding.
So unity allowed one bad decision to stop everything.
Potentially, yes. Europe, with its highly indented coastline, many peninsulas, islands like Britain and Ireland, and formidable mountain ranges like the Alps and Pyrenees, naturally fostered independent languages, ethnic groups, and crucially competing states.
Harder to unify.
Much harder.
Hmm.
But this disunity, paradoxically, meant that if one European state rejected an innovation like Christopher Columbus, being initially rejected by Portugal, France, and 2 Spanish noblemen, before finally gaining Spanish royal support, others might adopt it.
Competition drove innovation.
Exactly. This led to a faster overall pace of innovation and exploration for the continent, as competition among states was a powerful engine for progress in Europe that was often absent in a unified China.
And Africa, the continent of humanity's origins, how did these factors play out there given its immense size and diverse environments? It seems to encompass so many of these challenges.
Africa's history is indeed a complex tapestry where many of these factors converge. The continent's predominantly north-south axis significantly slowed the spread of domesticants, as we discussed earlier.
Right, the latitude problem.
Its indigenous crops, like sorghum and African yams, originated north of the equator due to climatic suitability, and none originated south of the equator. This meant a delayed and fragmented development of food production in many regions. The Bantu expansion, one of the swiftest colonizing advances in prehistory, saw Iron Age Bantu farmers from West Africa spread into southern Africa, displacing Khoisan hunter-gatherers.
Farmer power again?
A classic farmer power scenario, where the Bantu's greater population density and superior technology, iron tools, cattle, crops, adapted to their environment, overcame the local hunter-gatherers and herders. However, the delayed arrival of Fertile Crescent domesticates in sub-Saharan Africa, due to the continent's climate and disease barriers, like the tsetse fly belt preventing the spread of horses,
That's at sea fly, right?
meant African civilizations developed later than those in Eurasia, with profound consequences when Europeans arrived. Notably, Africa's native large mammals, such as zebra, African buffalo, rhinos, and hippopotamuses, could not be domesticated due to their inherent characteristics, applying the Anna Karenina principle once again, denying Africa the benefits of these animals for labor, food, and military use.
So no native horses or cattle equivalent that could be tamed.
Pretty much, south of the Sahara initially. And to summarize the Americas, we see the cumulative impact of several converging factors. Firstly, a late start for human settlement compared to Eurasia, maybe around 14,000 years ago. Secondly, a virtual lack of large domesticable wild mammals following those massive extinctions around 13,000 years ago.
Wiped out the potential candidates.
Exactly, leaving the Americas with only the llama alpaca as a major domesticate and, crucially, one that couldn't be ridden or pull plows. And thirdly, formidable north-south geographic and ecological barriers, deserts, rainforests, narrow land bridges that fragmented diffusion.
All those factors combined.
These factors meant food production took longer to support dense populations, and that many key technologies, including writing and the wheel attested only in Mexican ceramic toys, never widely adopted for practical use, either developed slowly or remained localized, creating disparate levels of power and affluence compared to Eurasia. For example, that Mesoamerican corn, taking 3,000, 4,000 years to spread 700 miles to the eastern U.S., significantly hindering the emergence of complex societies like the Mississippian chiefdoms until much later. The llama of the Andes never reached Mexico, leaving Mesoamerica without pack animals or a protein source comparable to those in Eurasia.
So we've covered a huge amount of ground, looking at environmental and geographic factors as ultimate explanations for history's broadest patterns. Does this mean history can be a science with predictable outcomes like physics or chemistry? Are we saying everything is predetermined?
Diamond firmly believes so, though with crucial distinctions. He argues that history can be developed as a science, on par with acknowledged historical sciences like astronomy, geology, and evolutionary biology.
Historical sciences, like looking back to explain.
Exactly. While human societies are incredibly complex, with numerous interacting variables that make exact prediction of specific events difficult, we can still provide a posteriori explanations. This means understanding why events unfolded as they did after the fact by identifying the chains of causation and underlying forces.
Okay.
We can also make predictions about what future archaeological discoveries will show us about past events by understanding these broad patterns. History is not just a collection of dates and names, but a field amenable to scientific inquiry, seeking to understand broad patterns and their causes, even if it's not like predicting the next eclipse.
So understanding the past scientifically, but not necessarily predicting the future perfectly.
That's a good way to put it. However, many questions remain unresolved, making history fascinatingly complex. For instance, within Eurasia itself, why did Europe, for most of history the most backward of the Old World regions, ultimately colonize America and Australia and become technologically dominant?
Yeah, that's a big one. Why Europe and not, say, China or the Middle East long term?
Well, from 8500 BC until after 500 BC, most major innovations in Western Eurasia, animal and plant domestication, writing, metallurgy, wheels, states arose in or near the Fertile Crescent. Europe, west or north of the Alps contributed little until around AD 900.
So Europe was a late bloomer.
Very much so. Subjected explanations for Europe's later rise include the environmental collapse of the Fertile Crescent itself due to deforestation, overgrazing, and salinization, which degraded its early advantage.
They kind of used up their head start.
That's one argument. And crucially, Europe's chronic political disunity, fostered by its jagged coastline and mountain ranges, paradoxically led to intense competition and faster innovation diffusion. If one state failed to adopt an innovation, another would, preventing stagnation.
Unlike China's chronic unity.
Which, as we discussed, allowed single decisions to halt progress across an entire empire. Europe's fragmentation meant a constant arms race of innovation and exploration.
That's a fascinating paradox, disunity leading to strength, a kind of creative chaos. But it sounds like we're saying that human agency, ingenuity, our choices are almost secondary to these massive environmental forces. Is there any room left for the individual or for cultural choices, or is it all just geography's iron fist?
Good question. Diamond acknowledges that human choices and cultural factors, which he calls wildcards, do play a role, especially in shorter-term events.
Wild cards? Like what?
Cultural factors, initially trivial and unrelated to environment, can become entrenched and predispose a society toward more important cultural choices. Think of the QWERTY keyboard's arbitrary success, which became globally dominant despite its inefficient design, simply due to early adoption and inertia.
Right, the keyboard example again.
Or the Sumerian-based 12 counting system, which gave us our 60-minute hour and 360-degree circle, in contrast to Mesoamerican-based 20 systems, an arbitrary cultural choice that had lasting impact. These cultural idiosyncrasies can act as wildcards, shaping history in ways not directly tied to environmental factors, and their effects can become quite long-lasting.
Okay, so culture matters too.
It does, and while Diamond argues that individual great men like Alexander the Great or Shaka Zulu didn't shape history's broadest patterns, their idiosyncrasies can undoubtedly influence shorter-term events. For example, he provocatively points out that a truck driver's braking response in Hitler's 1930 car accident could have changed World War II.
Whoa.
Showing how small changes at lower levels of organization can lead to emergent changes at higher levels of complexity, but they operate within the larger environmental framework.
So while environment provides a powerful, often overriding framework, it's not the only thing. There's still room for human choices, cultural quirks, and individual actions to play a role, making history a dynamic and endlessly complex field of study, even as we uncover its deeper currents.
Exactly. It's not pure determinism, but environment sets the stage and deals the cards, you could say.
What an incredible journey through 13,000 years of human history. We've seen how profound geographical differences in the availability of domesticable plants and animals, the orientation of continental axes, population size, and various barriers to diffusion fundamentally shaped the destinies of continents, leading to vast disparities in technology, political organization, and disease resistance.
It really covers immense ground.
It's a powerful paradigm-shifting narrative that compels us to reevaluate our understanding of global inequality.
Ultimately, this deep dive shows us that the differences between human societies are not due to inherent superiority or inferiority of peoples, but rather to advantages conferred by environment and geography. It challenges us to look beyond simplistic, often prejudiced answers and appreciate the profound, long-term forces at play in shaping human civilization.
A much more complex and less judgmental view.
Hopefully. If history, like nature, is constantly evolving, what does this understanding of its patterns mean for the challenges and opportunities facing our globally interconnected world today? What cargo will we create, and how will it be shared? How might understanding these deep historical forces help us navigate our future and avoid the pitfalls of the past, especially as we face global challenges that require unprecedented cooperation?
Those are big questions to leave our listeners with. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep making those connections. We hope this deep dive has given you a richer, more nuanced understanding of why the world looks the way it does.